I teach around the country in addition to teaching at Brooks Institute in California, and I hear this comment a lot about ratios, especially in the digital world. With the advent of Photoshop and the ability to change contrast, I have actually more professionals than I do students tell me that they don't really care about ratios and they don't need ratios anymore. What I find, the people that, I don't know, the artsy types and the creative types, I can understand that because it's kind of an interpretive thing they're trying to do. But for somebody that's actually making a living in the industry where you need a level of consistency and you're developing a particular look that you want to be able to hit time and time again, if you're a senior photographer, you want things in the yearbook or things from family to family or from child to child to look consistent. Also, you want your lab wants you to be able to do this because they're constantly having to make adjustments for you, or you're making adjustments in post-production to make everything look consistent, and it's so much easier to do it on the front end. There's just so many different variables that if you know how to get your lighting consistent, especially with ratios, then it just saves you so much time in post-production and gives you so much more professional look. So that's kind of what we're going to walk you through. I'm going to do it on an inside studio environment, and we'll talk about how to do it outside as well. So the slide I have up here now is just to give you some definition of terms. That's a slide I use in my regular PowerPoint presentations. I want to talk about the fill light, which I think all of you should be familiar with. And this is a fill light, normally comes from behind, and that's usually just to give density in the shadows. And it's usually not supposed to create a secondary direction of light, so it always comes from behind the camera. And in many of our studios across the country, I think a lot of us actually bolt that light to the back of the ceiling somewhere. So that's not the creative one, that's just the one to give density in the shadows. The second light over here is what some people call the key light or the main light. You hear that term used interchangeably. As a matter of fact, I use it interchangeably all the time also. So if I say key light or main light, I'm talking about this light, and it comes usually from the side, about 45 degrees off this way and about 45 degrees up. That's the one that gives direction and really personality to whatever you're doing. Background light goes and gives you density of the background, and then ultimately you have the let's see here. Yes, I am in control. The hair light that adds hair intensity over here. So by the way, you see numbers here. These are f-stop numbers, and I'll tell you how I use those in just a moment. We're probably going to be talking mostly today about the fill light and the key light and the relationship between the two. The hair light and the background light are just terms that I wanted to make sure that we understood. Which brings me to this. This is basically showing when you just have a key light and a fill light here, you add a background light here, then you ultimately add your hair light over there. So let's see here. So let's talk ratios. And ratios are really the difference between the highlight and the shadow side. And it's a numerical relationship. So in a 1:2 lighting ratio, that means that the highlight side is twice as bright as the shadow side. So in a 1:3 ratio, that means the highlight side is 3 times brighter than the shadow side. And in a 1:4 ratio, 4 times brighter than the shadow side. In the 1:5 ratio, it's a 5 times brighter than the shadow side. The numbers themselves probably aren't all that important. It's really coming up with a combination that works best for you. This is a really confusing topic because there's 2 ways of getting to this number. And what happens is that, unfortunately, I look at a lot of different sites to see what information is about how people are disseminating information, etc. And I could probably take you to 10 different websites that talk about ratios, and you would get 10 different descriptions of how to do it. And unfortunately, they all be wrong. It's really a difficult subject, only in the sense that there's 2 ways of doing it, and if you start mixing and matching them and don't really understand them, you end up in a lot of trouble. So I'm going to try to simplify it for you and make it realistic. I will tell you, you're probably going to make your living right here in a 1:4 lighting ratio. That's probably one of the most consistent ratios in the industry. That's what most of our clients are used to looking at, and that's what you want to be able to repeat on a time-to-time basis. Depends on who your clients are, and it also depends on the surfaces that you're using and the cameras that you're using and how you have them set. So it's going to depend on your relationship with your lab and working with your lab and finding out what you're getting your best results at or with. Another thing I've noticed is that it's impossible to do this without a light meter. And you all have in-camera meters, and I know a lot of people don't necessarily use light meters. I feel sometimes like I'm a lone voice out there because there are so many people, very good people, that are talking about how to do this without a light meter. I don't know of a way to do this without a light meter. You can guesstimate it. You can get really close with exposure without a light meter, but you can't really determine a ratio. Now, there's lots of meters out there. I'm going to talk about the Sekonic 358 for one reason. There are other good meters out there. They make a 758 version, and they make a couple of the less expensive versions, and then there's other manufacturers that make light meters also. There is a feature on this that I will demonstrate today that actually helps you in working outside. It's called percentages, and you'll see when I saw that feature for working outside, it just changed my life. So I'm going to walk you through how to get a basic ratio. And so what I'm going to do in this illustration I have, this is basically what you saw before. I had a fill light, and the fill light's going off at f5.6. So what I'm trying to demonstrate with this is I've made my fill light blue in this illustration, and I'm trying to illustrate that the fill light actually hits both sides of the face. Because it's coming from the camera angle, basically the light sees or hits whatever the camera sees. And so that's why we have the blue all the way around here. And what we're going to do is we're going to physically imagine that the face is kind of cut somewhat in half, in that there's two sides of the face. There's a shadow side of the face and there's the highlight side of the face. And the fill light actually illuminates both sides of the face, so it gets as much light on the shadow side as it does on the highlight side. That makes more sense when you get to the point when you add that key light or main light coming from the side. When you add that main light, you it only hits part of the face. It doesn't hit the shadow side of the face. It only hits the highlight side of the face. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. What I'm showing here with this block, the blue blocks, is that I'm calling 5.6 1 unit of light, okay? I'm going to then take my key light, and I'm going to make that actually brighter than the fill light by 3 times brighter. And that actually, one stop difference, it makes it twice as bright. A 2-stop difference makes it 4 times as bright. So actually 3 times as bright would be halfway between that, which would be a stop and a half brighter, which means that I'm going to put 3 blocks of light over here. And this light is actually, if I were to meter it alone, would go off at f8.5. And so you get 3 blocks of light from the key light, and you get 1 block of light on this side from the fill light and 1 block of light on this side from the fill light. So what that looks like is it's a 1:4 lighting ratio, because this side is 4 times brighter than this side. So it works out like this. If you were to take a meter reading of this light alone, it would give you 5.6. If you were to take a meter reading of this light alone, it would give you f8.5, and that would give you the 1:4 lighting ratio. This is where the tricky part comes in. So this is where you need to hold on. By the way, this is what I said before. The highlight side is twice as bright as the shadow side, which is a 1:4 lighting ratio. Actually, it's 4 times as bright. That's not good. 2 times brighter. 2 stops brighter is what I meant to say. But that's another story. Okay, so I guess I have to fix that after all these years. Here's the tricky part. There are 2 ways of metering and determining what a ratio is, and this is where the confusion comes in. There is what we call the source method, and then there's the additive method. So I'm going to walk you through the source method first, and then I'll take you to the additive method. And the additive method is the one I'm going to recommend that you use. So the one that I don't recommend you use, which still works just as well, is the source method. So you turn off your main light, and all you have is your fill light. And you take a meter reading on this light. So you put your meter right up here by the face, you point it back towards the fill light, and you take a meter reading, and it'll give you this number, f5.6. Then you turn this light off, and you turn this light on, and you take a meter reading towards the key light, and that will, whatever that is, it is, and in this case it's going to be f8.5, which is 3 times brighter than the other one. And so that's a stop and a half difference between these 2 when you meter them independently, and what it ends up giving you is a 1:4 lighting ratio. Now, that's the source method. The additive method, and this is the one I want you to remember, is you meter, you turn this light off, you turn off your key light, and you meter your fill light alone. So again, it's going to give you f5.6. You leave your fill light on, and you turn this one on so that both are on at the same time, and then you take a meter reading of both of them together. And that actually is going to be F11. And the reason for that is this one by itself, when we metered it in the source method, is actually F8.5. But because this light is still going off because you left it on, it's adding intensity to the key light, which when you put them together, it actually reads F11. So if you do the additive method, you end up with a two-stop difference between your fill light and your key light and your fill light together. So that's the one I'm going to recommend that you use. And so some people will say it's a stop and a half difference, gives you a 1 to 4. Other people will say it's a two-stop difference. And if they're doing the source method, they would be right when they say it's a stop and a half difference. If they're doing the additive method, they would be right if they tell you what's a two-stop difference. So having said all that, I want you to forget everything I just told you and follow me along with the additive method from here on out, because that's really all you want to know. And in the end, all you want to know, if you're going to deal with a 1 to 4 lighting ratio, the way I tell you to meter is that all you need to know is that you need a two-stop difference between your fill light alone and both your lights together, and that takes you exactly where you want to go. You don't need to know the math or the science behind it. This is why, however, the additive method works so well. I work outside an awful lot, and when you go outside, remember in the source method that I told you to meter this one alone, but then you turn this one off, and then you meter this one alone? Well, outside it's really hard to turn off the sun, and you can't turn off the ambient light very well. We tried all sorts of different things like shading the light and shading the meter and all the rest of those things. It just isn't very accurate. And so if you just use a method where you don't have to turn off your fill light, all of a sudden it works very well. So that's why the additive method, and that's why I suggest you use it. So let me take you through some examples real quick of how to do that. By the way, there's one other important thing. If you work in a studio with consistent lighting setups, so you use umbrellas or softboxes consistently, you won't have much of an issue with that. But each of the lights have their own characteristics. And so you see a large softbox over here, a medium umbrella here. This is a beauty dish, and this is a very small, like a spotlight. And you can see that it looks like the ratio changed dramatically on all these. There isn't a fill light on any of these. So that really what I'm trying to show you is that each of your lights have personalities. And if you're going to use an umbrella, the light wraps around a little bit more and can be a little bit more deceptive. And so if you're changing back and forth between light sources, you need to take that into consideration. They will have different looks. And some of you may notice that as you go into different environments, if you go on location a lot, you'll find that if you're in a white room versus a very large dark room, your ratios look a little bit different, and that's because it has to do with how the light bounces around the wall. So consistency is important, and learning how to do this is an important effect also. This is just a really abbreviated version of what I just told you. So the percentage part over here, don't worry about yet, because I'm about to describe that to you. That's how to do it outside. But this part right here, the 1, 2, 3 stop difference, and then the ratios right here, are really just a formula how to get there. So all you do is you measure the difference in f-stops between the fill light alone and the fill light and the key light together. Again, the additive method. So with you meter the fill light or the ambient light alone, and then you meter both the key light and the fill light together. And if there's a 1-stop difference between the two of them, it's a 1 to 2 lighting ratio. If there's a stop and a half difference between the two of them, it's a 1 to 3 ratio. If there's a 2-stop difference between, it's a 1 to 4, and a 3-stop difference, it's a 1 to 8. I'm guessing most of you aren't going to be using 1 to 8 unless you're trying to do something really creative. It's usually either going to be the 1 to 4 or the 1 to 3. Okay? Hopefully that's helpful. Let me take you back to where we were. I'm going to go outside and demonstrate how this can be effective outside also. And it's basically the same method, but one of the things I find in this marketplace, it's really difficult to make a living because so many other people have cameras and they have really good automatic modes, and as a result, they're able to do pretty much everything we can do pretty effectively. So I did this shot as a demonstration for one of my classes, and this is my camera set on TTL and on aperture priority. This is actually what I call the grandma shot, because this is what anybody can do. And I wanted to make this shot look a little bit different, and the way I did it was I took the flash off the camera, moved it a little bit to the side, and shot it from a creative camera angle because I didn't really want to see all this stuff over here. I wanted to see the sky. And even though TTL is relatively effective, it works many times pretty well, it doesn't often give you a creative choice. And so I went from that to this, and I hope there's a little bit of a difference. And I made a choice by using my meter to get proper exposure for this, and then I made a choice with the background to get proper exposure for this, and then I changed my camera angle, which literally meant I put my head on the ground. But it eliminated all this information in the background. But I moved the light off to the side, but I changed my camera angle and changed it from TTL to a manual setting and used a light meter and came up with that. I think it's an effective way of making an image that not everybody can make, and I think that's kind of the point. So here's an environment where there was ambient light and everything was fine, but I used a strobe and also a program called Indian Summer, I think it is, from Nick Filters that made the leaves go from green to fall. And just put a strobe right here and made it look a little bit different. Here's an example here. We do this this is probably the single best way to make your work look significantly different than everyone else's. I mean, this is a nice family down at the beach here in California, and this is me literally photographing it. But you can see me photographing. This is one of my students taking a picture with an iPhone behind, and you can see how everything blew out in the background, and there's no sense of direction. It's really flat because I have them in the shade. I have an assistant holding an umbrella off to the side, and I took a light meter reading doing a ratio, which, by the way, I'll use this number over and over again. It's actually about 40%. In that guide, that'll make sense to you when I describe it in just a moment. But you can see how now there's detail in the background. It's blown out, but there's a sense of direction. It looks like it's direct sunlight coming in, but in effect, it's really a strobe. It's just another way of doing it. Here's a shot that I did down at the beach in La Jolla, and this family showed up literally an hour late to a beach session, which means we usually start about an hour early. We got down to where the water was. The sun had set literally 10 minutes ago, so it's very dark. It's also, we have something in California called June gloom, which means it's very overcast. And I did this shot with one speed light, one light meter, and one tripod. And when I say the number 40%, you'll understand that that's all I did is I let my meter make the choice for me, and it was right there. And they were kind of blown away. This is the same thing. They were also blown away because my assistant, this is him describing how big the wave was that's crashing over them. But anyway, the same principle. It wasn't after sunset, though, but it was, you can see how bringing this light, this umbrella off from the side actually helps a lot. By the way, I put this on a monopod. It's just a speed light in an umbrella, and it creates that light. So these are the tools I use. This is the Sekonic L358. And then I happen to use this umbrella outside a lot. It's from Creative Light. It's called the Creative Light Box umbrella. The only reason I like that as opposed to a softbox is that softbox takes a long time to set up. An umbrella goes up and down very effectively. Unfortunately, outside, umbrellas have a tendency to turn inside out in the wind. And if you look at this umbrella, you can see that there's a diffusion panel over the front. So this doesn't turn inside out in the wind, and it works really well. So now let me show you how to use this light meter outside. And this is also the percentage section right here. For the outside and doing ratios outside, to me, is the most incredible tool I have ever seen. And that's not hyperbole. It really isn't. So I just did a real simple demonstration to illustrate this to you. And so, for example, the metering lights outside and using a strobe outside and coming up with a nice ratio or a consistent ratio has always been a hit or miss opportunity. It's easier with your digital cameras because you can see it on the back, but then at that you're only guessing and you're not that consistent. So what I did is I took this gal, put her in the shade. I took that umbrella I just showed you, put it on a light stand, took 1 meter reading with the strobe going off, and that's really important to remember. I took 1 meter reading. I didn't take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 each. I'm not changing the meter readings in anything that I'm going to show you. All I'm doing is, this normally runs as a video. I just pulled these out as stills, but normally you can see me rotate my fat little thumb here on this dial, and it changes just really the meter. It and the meter will tell you how to set your camera to get the different looks. So the things you need to look at when you use a light meter, there's normally a dome up here, and it tells you the f-stop and the shutter speed that you want to use to get proper exposure. There's another number up over here. You see the 80%? It's kind of hard to see on your screen. But this number right here, it says 80%. If you remember that chart I showed you before, 80% actually has a equivalent for a lighting ratio. And I'm going to take you back to that real quickly just so you can see it, because I'm going to scroll you through it. So you're going to see 80%, which is a 1:8 lighting ratio. And you're going to see 70%, which is a 1:4 lighting ratio. You'll see 60%, which is a 1:3 lighting ratio. I don't know if you'll see 50%. You'll see 40%, which is even less than that. But each of these numbers, these percentages, actually correspond to a lighting ratio. I live at 70% or at 40%. I told you I used 40% in a couple of those other images. And this is how it works. So I took one light meter reading, and my first light meter reading came up at 80%. It told me at 2/50th of a second, at 563, I would get a 80% rating. So 80% of the light's coming from the strobe, 20% is coming from the ambient, and it makes it look like that. That's a 1:8 lighting ratio. So what I did then is then I turned the dial. I didn't take another meter reading. I turned the dial until it said 70%. And so at 125th of a second, at 5/6 and 5/10 right here, it gives me 70%, which is a 1:4 lighting ratio, and it looks like that. Then I turned the dial again. Again, I did not take another meter reading. I just let the meter do the math. And so it says 60%. And so at 60th of a second, at almost f8, 5/6 and 9/10, it gives me a 60% or a 1:3 lighting ratio. Or I turned the dial again, and at 30% at f8 and 4/10, it gives me that. Or at 20% at 15th at f11 and 1/10, it gives you that. So 1 meter reading, just rotating the dial, lets me choose what I want to use. So I live over here at 70% and at 40%. The sunset shots I showed you, and pretty much everything I'm doing now outside, I've talked to a lot of other professionals that are using this meter. Their family groups outside, they shoot them at 40% with a backlit situation, and they're winning merits and loan prints off of that stuff. It's just that easy. Most of the people that are not using meters, they may either set it on TTL, which is generally pretty close, but it's not very consistent. But they go outside, and it usually takes them 2 or 3 or 4 shots to get to the point where they get the look they want, and then they start shooting. With my meter, I go out, and I set my light where I want it, and I, boom, take the shot, and I come home consistently with the shots I want without messing around. And I have a consistent look. I know exactly what ratio I want for what dramatic effect. I happen to live over here in the 1:8 or the 80% all the time because I like very dramatic work. But for my family groups outside that I know I'm wanting to do a 24 by 30, 30 by 40, or whatever it may be, this 40% shot is money for me. That's where I make my living. So let's see here. So this is what I was talking about. If you're doing the in-studio type of environment where you're shooting inside, so you're taking a meter reading of your fill light alone, and you get then you turn your key light on and get a meter reading, and if you get a 2-stop difference, it's going to be a 1:4. If you get a 3-stop difference, it's a 1:8. But most of you are going to want about a 1.5 stop difference to a 2-stop difference to give you that. If you go outside and use the percentages as I described, it's the same thing. It just does the math for you instantaneously. Now, if you don't have this percentage figure outside, you can do the same thing. You can take a meter reading of the ambient light and then turn your strobe on and then take a meter reading of both of them together. And if you get a 2-stop difference, you get a 1:4. The only advantage with Zirconic is that it actually shows your percentages, and you don't have to do the math in your head. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, I'm going to show you some actual illustrations outside. I just want to describe the before and afters on some of these circumstances. This is down in New Orleans at Imaging USA. I was down there teaching a class, and so this happened to be right across the street from the conference center. And literally, we took this gal outside, beautiful gal, and you can see the lighting on here. Most people assume the lighting on this is okay. It's just natural light, but if you see underneath the eyes, it's what we call raccoon eyes, or in China they call those panda eyes. And literally, we just took that umbrella I showed you and brought it off to the side and took my meter over there, set it for 40%, and did what it told me to do, and I ended up with that. You can see the better sense of direction here. We now have light in the eyes. It just works a little bit better. Not that the expression's any better, but you can see that there's just more punch here, much more direction, and much more consistency. We did the same thing, and this is what I wanted to show with the 40% in sunlight. You could have done the same thing with a reflector in this shot because we were out in direct sunlight, but literally you can see here that the lighting on the face is not all that amazing. We have this nice little edge light coming in over here, but bringing the strobe off to the side, taking 1 meter reading, setting it at 40%, I ended up with this. So, I probably could lighten this up a little bit, and this would be a nice shot anyway. But you can see that, again, bringing the light in would give you that directional light. Again, could it be done with a reflector? Yeah. But it's easy enough to do with the, I was really just demonstrating the strobe light and how easy it is to use the strobe outside when you have the meter. And let's see here. And one other thing I wanted to show you, I do find this an important thing. If you have only a strobe that goes on axis, so that's just on top of the camera, that can be an effective tool for filling in shadows. And obviously, if you're a wedding photographer like I am, you have to use lights like that on a regular basis because they are very spontaneous, very easy to use, and TTL functions very well in that circumstance. This is an illustration, however, of showing that changing direction in your light, especially if you're going to use it as a key light, can be really important. So what I did, in this case, I did this shot, and she's backlit here in kind of a shady area. You can see the shadow from the sunlight that the sunlight cast on her. By the way, you're also seeing that there's a lot of light coming from the concrete here. It's bouncing off the bottom of the chin, and the bottom of the nose is actually brighter than the top, which is something we try to avoid. We call that Bela Lugosi lighting. So I used a fill light, and I used a strobe, and I set it off coming from just at camera here, just a little, yeah, actually it's just a little bit camera right, but I set it off at 70%. And so I moved it then from there, and I moved it to the right. So in other words, you know, in the studio, when you move your key light 45 degrees off to the side over here and 45 degrees up, I did exactly the same thing with just a regular speed light. And in this case, I don't even think I used a modifier, right? If you know that most of your speed lights, you can point them up and pull up a little white card as a reflector card. That's all I used on this. And I set my camera for 70% and ended up like that. And then I moved to a 90-degree position. I moved all the way around to the side and then took a meter reading and got 70%. And I got this look, which it's kind of really nice edge look if she were looking away. And then I went all the way around to the side and created an edge light using the 70% position. So the first one I showed you, previous slide, is actually where it's on the camera. And this is me moving it a little bit to the side, moving it a lot to the side, moving it all the way around to the back. The idea being that moving the light around creates much more variety and, again, separates you from your competition, which is pretty much everybody these days. So, and then finally, I just showed this, not because it's really about ratios, but it's also a very popular look. It's just a variation of things we've already been talking about, and that's balancing the ambient light with the strobe. And these were not done with a speed light. You need a lot more power than this. This one could have been done with a speed light, but this needs about 1600 or 600 watt seconds or more to be able to pull that off. So I probably use TTL. Let me take this back. Okay, when I'm shooting weddings, especially receptions, I use TTL a lot because you're moving around so quickly and you can't really make adjustments. And so I use TTL. But I also use a two-light lighting setup on weddings. So I'll have a light on top of my camera, which will fill everything in. But I have a second person with a light off to the side. We call that a VAL, or a voice-activated light stand. And I'll move that person around. So most of the time they're about 45 degrees off to the side, creating a light from the side there like my main light. And so I have that on TTL also, and I'm using this system. I'm using the Pocket Wizard system, which is the Mini TT1, and the Flex, which is the TT5. Now, by the way, there are other people that make systems similar to this. Probably the best one I know is the radio poppers. I don't know of any other good TTL systems, but the reason I like the Pocket Wizards is actually the AC3 controller. So the AC3 controller actually goes on top of this guy here and allows me to control each of my shots independently. So if you remember the guy that was standing on the beach with the umbrella on the monopod, and he was showing the gal how big the wave was or whatever it was, I had that with my SB 800 pointing into the umbrella, and I had this mini and this AC3 controller on top of my camera. So from my camera, I could switch it from the M, which is the manual mode, to A, which is the TTL mode, or I could have turned it off instantaneously. But literally, if you see this dial, I had it in the manual mode, and this dial right here goes from 1 to 3 in the white, which is from 1 to 3 stops brighter in 1/3 stop increments, or it goes darker in 1/3 stop increments all the way to 3 stops darker. So by turning this little knob here, which you can barely see, you just rotate that to how bright you want it. And that is so much easier than going up to the flash meter, to the flash and going half power, eighth power, whatever it is, because that takes seconds, if not minutes, to do that. Whereas all I have to do is I rotate this dial down here, and I can go in 3rd stop increments. So literally, I walk up with my meter, point my meter at the light source, and then just dial it to whatever I want using this controller, and that's how I work outside. So it's so much faster. But I periodically will put it on TTL, and I just switch it there to that system.